So thank you again for the invitation. And what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is not just the IPCC, but also the National Climate Assessment, as well as the different scales of assessment that occur across the United States. Let's see. So my favorite definition of assessment comes from Bill Clark's team at Harvard. Climate assessment specifically is a formal effort to assemble select knowledge with a view toward making it publicly available in a form intended to be useful for decision making. So the thing that I want to focus on today is that decision-making piece and really the relevance and the efficacy of climate assessment as, with regard to policy. These are just a smattering of the climate assessments that have been released over the past 5 years across the United States, and they are by no means comprehensive in the sense that, or this list is by no means comprehensive. The best estimate that we have is that about 100 different climate assessments have been developed across the United States to support local, municipal, regional, watershed scale decision making, as well as state and, of course, as well as the state and the federal level. So, as I mentioned, the question that I really want to explore, and the question that my team has been working on, is what are the policy impacts of different scales of assessment? So to kind of explore this question, what I'd like to focus on are 3 specific assessments that are designed to target specific policymakers at different scales. The first, of course, the IPCC, with which I'm sure everybody here is familiar, and specifically the 5th assessment report products that were released between 2013 and this year. The second, the National Climate Assessment, another entity with which I'm sure most of you are familiar, and the National Climate Assessment document, which was released by the White House in May of this year, as well as the suite of technical inputs that went into the National Climate Assessment. And then the third scale of assessment that I want to deal with is produced by the Western Water Assessment. And I'm going to be focusing here on assessments that support statewide decision making. And specifically with the case of Western Water, a climate report for the state of Colorado that was developed in partnership with the state government. Western Water, I'm sure most people are not familiar with, is one of 12 NOAA-sponsored programs across the United States that really focuses on, well, for lack of a better characterization, regional climate services. So first, let's look at these 3 organizations before we delve into the products. When you look at the mission statements for these 3 organizations, we see words like risk, we see vulnerability, we see management, climate impacts. It's very clear that each of these entities really fall into and are designed in order to support assessment, and specifically of climate change and climate vulnerability. But when we're talking again about assessment, we really need to focus on that decision-making piece. So let's look at the very specific engagement activities that the way in which each of these entities and organizations engages with decision makers. With the IPCC, I know that there are several IPCC authors, former and current, in the audience. It's a very formal process. We have the UN and the process really operates under the auspices of the United Nations as well as the World Meteorological Society. It's a very formalized engagement, and everything from soup to nuts in this process really has to be moved through very formal negotiations. With the National Climate Assessment, we have Emily Cloyd in the audience, who's very, very familiar with this. That process actually started out very much as a stakeholder-driven process, with lots of workshops to try and assess what are the needs of stakeholders and how can the science be developed to really support those stakeholder needs. But as the process continued, it became more of a top-down process, and that is largely driven because of federal policies and rules and mandates from both the federal agencies that were engaged as well as emerging from the White House. And then with Western Water Assessment, they have the luxury of flying somewhat under the radar. As a consequence, the product there was developed and really co-produced in the vernacular that we would use with stakeholders. In other words, the authors that were part of the people that were part of the author team were also some of the stakeholders and decision makers that were going to be using the product. So when I look across the spectrum from IPCC, National Climate Assessment, down to the Western Water Assessment, we're really looking at what I would characterize as a loading dock approach with respect to IPCC versus a co-production model in Western Water, and the NCA really falls somewhere in the middle. So what about the policy impact? One of the things that I think it's very fair to say, that both the IPCC and the NCA would have benefited from, or would benefit from in the future, is ensuring that they have an evaluation process that's implemented at the beginning of the assessment process. That is something that has actually been part of the Western Water assessment process, and so the Western Water, in terms of developing their products, are very much able to show what the impact of their assessments have been. With respect to IPCC, we had the COP20 meeting, which just concluded. I think it's fair to say, once again, that the emissions, the soft commitment from the parties to the emissions discussion at the UNFCCC meeting in Paris next year are modest at best. One really has to question to what degree were the impacts outlined in the fifth assessment report really being considered in terms of identifying what those emissions, soft emissions targets were going to be. With respect to the National Climate Assessment, the President's Climate Action Plan, the NCA has really provided a springboard for the implementation of many of the actions that have been outlined in the Climate Action Plan, and we're seeing a lot of movement by the administration based on the science that's been developed. Lastly, the Western Water Assessment Project. Colorado State Water Plan was just released last week. That water plan, I think it's fair to say, would not have included climate change had it in the consideration of that plan had it not been for the Colorado Climate Report. So I've just looked at some of the benefits of the different assessments, so let's look at the costs. I will say it's very difficult to actually track down the cost and how much money and what the budgets related to different climate assessments are. A GAO report that was focused actually on the fourth assessment report from the IPCC estimated that about $3 million was spent by the United States each year just for the administrative cost of the IPCC. That had to do specifically with supporting the technical support unit for the Working Group 1 report at that time, and it also covered travel for some of the authors who do not have federal affiliations. I think $3 million a year over those 6 years is a very low sort of estimate of what the federal investment in IPCC has been. Based on some discussions with people I can't name within NOAA, they estimate roughly $10 million was spent each year by the U.S. government to support the National Climate Assessment, and that was over a 3-year time period, so we're looking at $30 million. Colorado Climate Report, $90,000, and it was produced in 9 months. Now, before I could actually jump to the conclusion here and say that the Western Water Assessment product had, you got your biggest bang for your buck, one really has to ask the question, what are the synergies and the commonalities among these different reports? Could the Colorado Climate Assessment happen without the IPCC and without the NCA? Well, one of the things that we have in common that can be both a pro as well as a con are the author teams. There are approximately 830 coordinating lead authors, and review editors associated with the IPCC, the latest fifth assessment report. The National Climate Assessment, 200 CLAs and lead authors, and the Western Water Assessment Report, 45 authors. Of course, these are not unique authors. So I'm going to actually add something else in here to consider, which is this, just so that we can map these author teams. And those are the authors that were involved in producing the Southwest technical input to the National Climate Assessment. And there were 120 authors there. So let's look at this map. Oopsie daisies, sorry. Yeah. So IPCC, of the authors, 176 were US authors. There are about 20% of the authors affiliated with the IPCC and working on the IPCC report were also working on the National Climate Assessment. We had 2 of the NCA authors were contributing to the Colorado Climate Report. When I throw in that Southwest technical input, we have even more mapping occurring. We have more people that are involved in even more assessment, and we have the one lucky individual that was involved in 3. Unfortunately, that was me. But what we need to think about is that this kind of exercise could actually be carried out for every piece of for every assessment, every technical input that went into the NCA. The pro here is that you have folks who really understand how assessment works, who really are grounded in conveying uncertainty, in understanding the vernacular of assessment. The con is that we really have to consider, are we assessing ourselves to death? In some ways, it's a zero-sum game. The more time that I spend on assessment, the less time that I'm spending really getting into the weeds on some of the original research that needs to go into assessment. It's a double-edged sword. I think, of course, the obvious thing that is in common among all these is the science. And I specifically want to focus on the climate model intercomparison projects, CMIP-3 versus CMIP-5, because I think this is a huge challenge for the science community and from a communication perspective. So, IPCC Working Group Run Report came out September of last year, and of course, it was grounded in CMIP-5 outputs. Well, in May of 2013, that's when the Southwest technical input had to be produced and released. Well, unfortunately, at that point, the CMIP-5 outputs were not available. So the technical input is CMIP-3 data. National Climate Assessment was released. CMIP-3, a lot of the projections in terms of the physical environment were CMIP-5 data, but the impacts information was based primarily on CMIP-3. Then we have the Western Water Report, which came out after that, which had both CMIP-3 and CMIP-5, but some of the CMIP-5 data were mature enough such that you could make some impact statements. So when we're looking at this entire process and the timelines on which all of these assessments emerge, one could end up in a case where information that is being conveyed and some of the statements that are made relative to the climate impacts are contrary. This is I'm bringing up the Colorado example because the CMIP-3 hydrology versus the CMIP-5 hydrology are actually counter to one another in terms of messaging. The message for Colorado has been hotter and drier for the most part. Unfortunately, for a lot of us climate communicators, the new CMIP-5 hydrology also says, but it could be hotter and wetter. So one could see that this puts the decision makers and the folks that have really been champions of climate information and bringing that in decision-making framework in an awkward position. So when we're thinking about assessment, I think that there are a lot of things that we need to consider. First, we really need to consider where we're investing not only our money, but our time. All these climate assessments, yes, they're very important. They do inform decision making. But is there a way that we can think about the integration among different scales of assessment in a more comprehensive way so that we're not wasting one another's time, but rather, as a community, we're really trying to build support and build kind of that knowledge network that's needed to support decision making. I think that evaluation, and I'm sorry that I didn't have enough time to go into this, is absolutely critical for really even understanding how we're going to integrate across all these pieces. And lastly, we really need to be thinking about the interplay among different scales and all of the information that emerges from the science, and how we're going to communicate that, particularly if we have counter messages emerging based on different pieces of science. And thank you.
We have time for a question.
Hi, Bihar.
Hi, Kristen. Speaking of scales, I had an intern dive into the National Climate Assessment in every page that he could look through and find a place where a description of the finer scale information was evaluated and then selected. And he was unsuccessful in finding any kind of coherent discussion of why this why this data set was used and why that data set was used. And so for evaluations both in advance and in the after these reports are done, to what extent do you think there should be transparency as to which downscaling tools and why? And how can that be made to happen more clearly in these kinds of reports so that people who are actually familiar with these things can look to them for guidance on that question?
Well, first of all, that's really disappointing to hear because I would actually argue the NCA has done a tremendous job in terms of transparency and in terms of the accounting for any statements that really emerged from that. I do think, however, there could be an opportunity for getting users, for getting stakeholders, getting decision makers in the room to sit down to co-design what that kind of interface might actually look like. So that way people can dig down and find that information. But again, I find that kind of a bummer because I found it relatively easy compared to other documents and other assessments that have emerged to find that information.
Thanks again. Thank you. Okay.